Hi there, I'm Brendan Burns, Kubernetes co-founder and now corporate vice president at Microsoft Azure, where I focus on cloud native and open source computing. And I'm here to talk to you about how you can be future ready with Azure, the open cloud. But first, I'd really like to welcome you to Open Azure Day. It's really fantastic that we can connect through this event and through this streaming around the world to discuss how open source and Azure can help you deliver the business requirements that you need to accelerate your business. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about me. I've actually had a ton of experience in open source communities, starting with actually installing NetBSD on some old computers that happened to be lying around the computer lab. No one was using them. In fact, I think they were on their way out to the junk heap. And I said, can I take that? And the only operating system that I could figure out how to get on, and frankly that I could afford, since it was free, was NetBSD. And that was really the beginning of an open source journey that led me to be a maintainer of the JMeter project, to actually contribute a patch to the Linux kernel to make my laptop battery work back when every new laptop running Linux was an adventure, all the way through to the founding of the Kubernetes project and building up that very large, very vibrant open source community. So I've been around open source for a long time, but I've also seen how open source has transformed in cloud to be something that is an essential component of every application. It's no longer something that somebody's going to discover in a computer science lab. It's now something that is an essential part of practically every service and every API that you're seeing out there in the cloud today. And when you're thinking about that journey to the cloud, I think that one of the things that people are thinking about is, how do I get from my current state in my data center, especially in times like this with high CapEx costs, with a lot of limits on the scalability. We've seen companies that have had to double their capacity to respond to, remote workforces or to, new demands around e-commerce. All of those things are really hard when you're doing things in your own data center. And I think as we think about this open journey to the cloud, you're getting access to, up-to-date hardware with no upfront costs. You're getting the ability to scale dynamically and even to take advantage of cloud-native patterns like blue-green deployments, where you can turn up an entirely new copy of your application and then tear down the old one after you've tested it to make sure that it works. Things like that are just not feasible if you actually have to be responsible for the hardware that everything is running on. And then as you think about deploying your software, and a lot of open source software as well, you have access to things like Azure Security Center that really can provide you with best practices and all of the latest information about where there are vulnerabilities, where you need to update things to ensure that your applications are reliable and compliant. I think one of the most important things to think about when you're thinking about the cloud is, what are the capabilities that it can provide? And Azure can provide the best-in-class support for Linux and container infrastructure. And I think this is because we have a deep understanding of what it takes to run Linux in a hyperscale cloud. We have a deep understanding and engagement in both the Linux and container communities, contribute source code to all of these environments. We also have deep partnerships with a ton of great other providers like Red Hat, both in their Red Hat Enterprise Linux as well as in OpenShift, and many other partners who can bring their own open source expertise, like HashiCorp for continuous delivery, or tools like Console on Azure. They can bring their experience to bear on your application. Additionally, we have a ton of great options like the Azure Hybrid benefit, which you can use to ensure that your journey up from on-premise into the cloud is as cost-effective as possible. And then finally, all of our tooling around security, manageability, and all of these tools apply natively to Linux and open source environments, meaning that you can access all of the same tools that you expect out of any cloud on the Azure cloud. And all of this is happening within this great Azure ecosystem of partners and services developed by Microsoft. I think when we think about our approach to open source, I want to highlight a lot of the things that we think make us tick. And one of the most important things that we want to be able to do is be excellent at managing open source software. Right? We want to, if you need to run a Postgres database, if you need to run Kubernetes as a service, if you need to run an open source piece of software like Hadoop, we want to be best in class at running that for you. Because the truth is that when you're thinking about Postgres or Kubernetes or Hadoop or anything else, you're you're focused on a business objective. You're not focused on learning how to manage that software. And in fact, we have to build teams within Azure to focus on managing that software. That's great for us since we can provide it to our customers. It's not really something that you as a customer want to do. You want to focus on your business, right? And so you can trust Azure to get deep embedded into these open source communities, learn what it takes to manage and run them at scale, and apply that expertise into your environments so that you can build on top and leverage this open source software without having to necessarily develop all of the skills necessary to manage it and run it at scale. I think another approach that was really important to us is contributing back to these communities, right? So it's not sufficient to just take open source software, run it, and sell it. That's not really what open communities are about. And more importantly, it's actually not a really great way to deliver managed open source, right? If you're not in the communities, if you don't have access to, the latest updates and the latest patches, as well as the discussions around architecture, where the community is taking it, you're not going to have the ability to develop a good roadmap, to be able to talk to customers about how they should use the software. And so in addition to managing open source software, we really strongly believe we want to contribute back to these communities. And that means connecting a bunch of people around the world to Microsoft employees who are contributing to things like Kubernetes, who are involved in, making patches to Kubernetes that add IPv6 support that work for everybody, whether they're an Azure customer or not, contributing code to the Linux kernel that works for people running Linux anywhere, not just people running on Azure, right? And so being a part of these open source communities is an incredibly important part of what it takes to really deliver open innovation in the cloud. And then finally, I think when we think about open source, we also want to be creating new open source projects and new open source products that people love, right? So we're going to take existing projects and products that people want, run them incredibly well. We do that with Postgres. We do that with Kubernetes. We're going to contribute back into a ton of these existing projects and existing communities. But we also really believe in developing new communities, in innovation out in the open. And you can see that in things like VS Code, which is now one of the most popular editors for code out there for code running anywhere. You can see that in tools like Helm, which is the de facto package manager for Kubernetes, which has the majority of code that's deployed out into Kubernetes is deployed using Helm. You can see that in new innovation like the Dapper project, which is just going to its 1.0 release and provides sort of a standard library for cloud native applications, which makes it easier for you to do things like connect to event streams or connect to storage infrastructure. All of these are examples of open innovation that is driven out of Microsoft, but really works for anyone, anywhere. And also open communities where we invite people to come in and give back, right? Because that's another important part of all of this, is that not only, do we produce products that people love, but we actually enable those people to then come in and, change those products, add to those products to make them even better. And that's really another part of this virtuous cycle that occurs when you're not just running open source, but you're contributing and creating open source as well. And I think another really important part, though, of our approach to open source is meeting customers where they are, right? And I think that we can't just say, oh, you know what, just rub a whole bunch of open source on it, jump from your existing processes into these communities, and figure it out, right? We need to actually take customers along on the journey. Just like Microsoft has gone through a journey in its approach to open source, we want to take our enterprise customers along on that journey into how they can, start using open source, start, running open source at scale, start contributing back to open source projects, and even to creating their own, right? So we actually engage with our customers to help them understand if they have developers who want to launch new open source projects, what does it take? What does it take to build a successful piece of open source? Another really important part of that is things like the Azure hybrid benefit, right? Which means that we can meet people where they are with existing license commitments to open source software. So if you have an existing Red Hat license, you can take that license and use it to run Red Hat in Azure, right? And there's no need to purchase a new license for Azure. It's a great way of meeting people, where they are, running enterprise Linux on premise, and enabling them without any real cost to move into Azure and take advantage of those savings. And so I think all of these are great examples of how we don't just sort of do open source ourselves, but we actually help enterprises along on their open journeys. I think another part of this that we're doing out in these open communities is taking cloud out to on-premise environments. This is another way that we meet people where they are, because they have things like ships, they have things like cars and other kinds of edge devices. They have factories and branch offices, and they need to be able to manage those things just like they manage things in the cloud, right? And so Azure Arc is our way of connecting out to open source software and really any software that is running out in environments that aren't the Azure data center. So take, for example, Azure Arc for servers. With Azure Arc for servers, you can connect the Azure control plane to Linux servers running anywhere. They can be running virtualized in a VM environment. They can be running on physical hardware. They can be running in a branch office. They could be running under a desk in a closet somewhere. I actually have Azure Arc connected to some Linux servers that are running in my basement. And you can then use all of the cloud management tools around monitoring, policy, compliance, and security to ensure that all of those Linux servers, whether they're on-premise, in the cloud, or anywhere else, look exactly the same and are kept up to date. And so really, I think one of the things that we want to deliver with Azure in the cloud is not just cloud-based things, but actually management that goes anywhere with you. We do the same thing for Kubernetes, enabling you to do cloud-native application development and GitOps. And this is a great example of, again, how we partner with open source, because we use Flux, which is a CNCF project, to actually do the GitOps configurations of these clusters. I think what we're also seeing is that Kubernetes is developing into this universal control plane where people are building platform on top of Kubernetes. And so by supplying Kubernetes both in Arc and in Azure, we're actually providing an open platform for open innovation that happens on top. And working with partners like Spring, working with open source projects like Prometheus, artificial intelligence frameworks like PyTorch, data like Cassandra, and even our own products like SQL Server are all coming to run in containers out on Kubernetes, either in-premise or on the edge. And I think what this is really meaning is that we can build a cloud platform of the future that isn't just about what Microsoft builds, but is really about what we can build together. And I think really that's the true inspiration of all of these open communities, that when we come together and work on projects and address customer pain and business needs as a group and not as individuals, we really build something that's better than any of us could build by ourselves. So welcome to Open Azure Day. We've got a ton of great content, and we're really excited to have you here. Check out all the sessions that we have coming up, including some great content from our open source partners who have joined us during this Open Azure Day. Coming up next, we've got Scott Guthrie and the other Brendan from Adobe who are going to be talking about Adobe's open source journey on Azure. Off to you, Scott.
Thank you, Brendan. It's great to see some of the innovation that we're bringing to market to help our customers do more for their businesses. My name is Scott Guthrie, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the Cloud and AI Group here at Microsoft. And we're building, as part of my team, Azure as really the world's computer, and really trying to design every layer of it to meet the real-world needs of our customers and deeply embrace openness. Azure brings literally thousands of services to market every year with lots of new capabilities that can enable you to run your businesses more reliably and at bigger scale. And to really achieve that, we're working deeply with and contributing to both the Linux and the open source community. The majority of Azure compute workloads now run Linux, including mission critical applications and workloads that our customers rely on every day to run, literally the largest organizations in the world. And at our Ignite conference, we announced some of our new hybrid capabilities, including the general availability of our Azure Arc for Linux servers. So you can not only manage Linux servers inside Azure, but also in on-premises as well as other cloud environments. And today, really excited to announce the general availability of our Azure Hybrid Benefit for Linux offering, which makes it simpler and more cost-effective for you to migrate your existing Linux workloads to Azure. Our platform really across Azure and across the Microsoft stack is really designed to be open and integrative with our Linux partners. We're committed to offering a trusted, open, hybrid cloud that meets our customers' ever-changing demands. And with that, it's my pleasure to have Brandon Pulsifer, who's Adobe's VP of Cloud Infrastructure, here to join me to talk about our journey together as they've moved to Azure and as they've transitioned to the cloud, and talk about their experiences and reflections as part of that journey. Brandon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and it's great to share our Linux journey on Azure with some more folks today.
Now, Adobe runs, a huge number of Linux workloads on Azure. And for people that aren't aware, Adobe builds one of the most sophisticated SaaS applications and cloud native applications on the planet to serve both creative professionals and marketing. And I was hoping, Brandon, maybe you could share a little bit more about your journey and how working on Azure has enabled your customers to achieve their goals.
Adobe has been, I think, changing the world through digital experiences since we were founded in 1982. And whether that's through our digital media products like Creative Cloud and Document Cloud, or our enterprise solutions as part of our Experience Cloud, we help consumers and companies really create and deliver the most engaging experiences across all their channels and all their touch points. So the customer experience is really a center and the passion at the center and the passion of everything we do. And we made some decisions many years ago to choose Linux and an open source stack to build our technology on. So this was a really important part of our choice around our workloads and how and where we run those, and especially a part of our journey from private cloud to public cloud. And I'm really pleased to share our journey and our choice with Azure to help us scale quickly, to expand globally, and improve the reliability and security of our products. So, our journey started, my journey here, and I think our Adobe journey started about 2017. So we started putting production workloads on Azure. And we knew Microsoft and Azure were committed to Linux and the open source community and expanding the portfolio. But at the time, the open source support for things like Linux, some of the open source languages, like Python and Java and others, wasn't quite there as kind of first-class members of the Azure. But it's been really pleasing to see Microsoft invest and Azure now make significant progress to support Linux and an open source stack on Azure, and it's allowed Adobe to take advantage of that.
It's again, for people that maybe aren't familiar, just knowing the scale at which Adobe operates, it literally is probably one of the largest set of cloud native solutions built anywhere on the world. And it's just been fantastic partnering with Brandon's team, as part of this journey and building it out as part of Azure. Now, Brandon, I know, we're seeing really kind of rapid acceleration in the adoption of cloud, really to support a wide variety of scenarios related to the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's business continuity, remote workers, distributed operations, and obviously connecting in new ways to customers that is now essential because so much has moved online. So wondering, how has this affected Adobe and other sort of learnings that you can share with the audience as part of that journey?
Yeah, certainly as part of the global health crisis, we've all had to kind of adjust and make changes, both individually and as larger organizations. Our Adobe's workloads on Azure really are mission critical, both kind of software as a service and managed service offerings across all three of our cloud solution areas. And COVID hasn't really changed our strategy on how we use public cloud and Azure. But certainly we have seen changes, acceleration by many customers in their digital transformation, the need to be more elastic or move online more quickly. And so while our strategy continues to be providing cloud-based software as a solution, just our innovation built on top of an open source stack, Azure is a really key part of that. So we're able to leverage the infrastructure as a service and the platform as a service that has capabilities to support remote workers, to provide business continuity, to just ensure global round-the-clock operations and ensure our customers are successful. And we leverage a large set of Azure services to do that. Everything from kind of the basic, compute, virtual machines, and storage to Azure Data Lake and Data Factory to database technologies like Cosmos DB, MySQL, Postgres, and we've been able to adapt to the variable demands that COVID has brought.
That's great. And I know, one of the things that we've also worked together on solving is some of the challenges around patching, both for Linux and Kubernetes projects, especially in upstream patching, and how we deal with that. And kind of curious if maybe you could share your perspective on running open source workloads with both VM-based services and cloud-native container services like Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure. And what's your advice to other companies as they think about good ways to manage that?
Yeah, I think this has been a really important area for us, and I think we're all in tech, so we know things are going to break, right? That's the one sort of predictable element is things will go wrong, bugs will get introduced, and so there's always going to be work to do to mitigate or prevent issues. And so it's really important to I'd say two things we've learned: one, to have a strong community that we can leverage, and two, to have a really strong partner. And Microsoft for us is that trusted partner. And Adobe and Microsoft are both very significant contributors to the open source community and the upstream code. And so as issues come up, we work closely together to solve them. You mentioned I think one of the examples that really stands out to me is our journey with Kubernetes. So Kubernetes on Azure is our container orchestration platform. And as we ramped up, we did run into a few issues at scale. Our teams came together. We worked with Microsoft. We identified an issue in the upstream Kubernetes code, and Microsoft then took on the responsibility and the initiative to fix that. Not just for Adobe, not just for Azure, but for the community, and everybody benefits. And that's the kind of partnership and the trusted partner that I want to do business with.
Thanks, Brandon, for sharing your insights with me and the audience today. It's been just fantastic working with Adobe as part of your journey to Azure, and as you built out all these amazing new services at just tremendous scale. And we really look forward to continuing this journey with you in the years ahead.
It's awesome. Thanks for having me. We look forward to a long relationship together and continue to learning what's next and from the open source on Azure and all that you're doing there.
Great. And thank you everyone who's watching this for joining us today. Up next, we're bringing Sarah Novotny and our partners from the Linux ecosystem to have a fireside chat about trends, challenges, and the paradigm shift they see ahead.